Hey, Lindsay, I see your message. You can test now if you'd like.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, can hear you.
Yay, great. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Do I sound okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Or is this better? This one or this one? Or both
like,
are...
Maybe the first one, it's kind of like an eye doctor appointment.
Yeah. And they changed the glasses. So not much difference.
How do I pronounce your name? Is it Khan or Ken?
It's Khan.
Khan, okay.
Khan, yes. You need to like have two Khan.
Khan, okay.
Yeah, Khan. Oh Lord, I'm a little nervous. Just a little, not too much.
You don't have to be. We're all friends here.
I was also wondering if you were able to pull up that recording at all.
Recording. Oh, did you? I guess you must have emailed me.
Yeah, it's in a Google Drive link, and yeah, I'm just worried I'm going to get booted from the Zoom call as soon as I start talking with everybody on there. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to download it now. All right, Lindsay, I have it and it seems to be working fine. So in case you get booted, we can play that.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you.
No problem. Hey, Patty, we start at 8:20, right?
I think we started at 8.
8?
For the welcome. I think there's this the first 20 minutes is served for the welcome.
Okay.
I don't know. It says yeah, it says on the schedule that yeah, we start at 8, but that's what it says on Drifto page.
Okay. Well, I don't have a whole lot of things to say during the welcome, so I might wait until about 5 minutes before your presentation. So.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, we'll just let people gather. I can put up the welcome slide. And we'll go from there.
Sure.
Does that look good?
Looks good.
Okay. Gives everybody a minute to fill up their coffee cup.
If you're just joining, we're waiting until 8:20 for our first presenter, but shortly before that, I'll have some announcements. So just hang on tight. As Patty said in the chat, get some coffee, get your feet up. So hold on tight. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Welcome and Conservation session this Friday morning. Today's the last day of the conference, so hope you're excited. It's going to be a busy day. Before we get to the presentations, I want to make a couple of announcements. We have a virtual auction. Patty linked it in the chat, so you can go and check it out. There's also a raffle for a handmade quilt by Stephanie Jones. So please consider buying a raffle ticket. They're $5. Apparently these quilts are very famous. Some other announcements. Check out the Waterbird Slack workspace. It's a great place to touch base with presenters and continue the conversation if you don't have a chance to ask your question here and during the session. We'll link that in the chat as well. And today we're going to be having the committee fair at 4 p.m. and shortly after that, the business meeting, so please attend those. And then at 6:15 will be the awards ceremony. So all important parts of the Waterbird Society. And that'll be kind of when we give the closing remarks and any important announcements for the society. So without further ado, our first presenter is going to be Khan today, and he is presenting about functional responses of breeding wetland birds to habitat degradation and climate change. So Khan, you can go ahead and share your screen. You should have the co-hosting power. And whenever you're ready, you can take it away.
Thanks for the introduction, Jeff. Is my screen sharing working? Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
All right, then I can start. I'll just start my timer just in case I may lose track of time. So my name is Khan, and today I will be talking about a recent study of ours, which is about the functional responses of breeding wetland bird communities to wetland habitat loss and degradation, and a little bit of climate change. So before I dive right into the study, I feel like it can help you to understand by giving you some condensed or capsule format information can help you better understand what I'm about to tell you. So there is this whole field of ecology called functional ecology or trait-based ecology. And there's an important concept in this field of ecology called the concept of functional traits. So these traits are actually the features of organisms that somehow relate to their fitness, their survival and reproductive success. And if you're speaking about waterbirds, they can be stuff like body mass, bill length, and stuff like nesting substrate. And if we do use these functional traits to quantify diversity of communities, then it can be called functional diversity, which is simply defined as a trait diversity of a community. And because of the way that it's defined, quantification of functional diversity can have some advantages over the more conventional measures, the taxonomic measures, such as being more readily related, more readily relatable, being more readily relatable to, stuff like ecosystem functioning and responses of the communities to disturbance. So the case study that I'm about to present is about breeding wetland birds. So I don't only have water birds. So we've used the definition, we use the IUCN habitat classification to define wetland birds. So a species that has any kind of wetland system listed in their IUCN habitat, we took them in. So that means that I don't only have the water birds, but I also have reed-dwelling birds such as the reed warblers or even common cuckoos. And our study site is a closed basin in Turkey called Konya Closed Basin. And it's a large basin. It's 25% larger than the Netherlands. It's big. And there are some things that you need to know about this basin to better understand what's happening here. So this basin, it's a semi-arid basin. It has a temperate continental climate. We have warm summers and cold winters here, but it's semi-arid. And there's been a recent shift to more irrigated crops. So people have been abandoning non-irrigated crops such as wheat, and now they're preferring money crops such as sugar beet, maize, and sunflowers. And another study of ours showed that the climate in the region is also changing in a bad way. So the basin is becoming warmer in most of its part. And what you also need to know about the climate change in this region is the warming, it's actually more intense during the summertime. So summer temperatures are increasing more intensely than the other seasons. And the remote sensing team that I've been working with, they have been trying to come up with a salinity index to use remotely sensed data to get some idea about the salinity of the wetlands. And so they've done that successfully, and we have found that the lakes, the wetlands in the region, they are getting more saline, probably because of an increase in pan evaporation. And all of this has resulted in an unprecedented wetland loss in the region. We have lost marshes that were as big as cities, and the remaining ones, they're highly degraded and now more saline. And our research questions were, how did this habitat loss and degradation affected the breeding waterbird or breeding wetland bird communities, both taxonomically and functionally? And we also studied the changes in the diversity patterns, the spatial changes, and we also investigated the changes in individual functional traits. So we also focused on some functional traits. And our major data sources were two breeding bird atlases, one conducted in 1998 and another in 2018. And we used a total of 87 functional traits. And we did use some basin-specific scoring whenever possible. So we used data obtained from the basin to score the functional traits for each of our species, which, by the way, we had a little bit more than 120 species. And we quantified functional and taxonomic diversity at different spatial scales. And the functional diversity metric that we most commonly use is called functional richness. And this functional richness is basically the functional volume occupied by a community in trait space or in niche space or in functional space, you can call it. So what we do is we score traits for each species. And if you try to plot the species in an n-dimensional functional space, then the species, they end up being or represented by points. And if you try to get the most convex polygon or simply the convex hull volume of the community, then you get the functional richness. So it's basically the volume occupied by a community in functional space. So we use this metric in our study as a functional diversity measure. And we found that the loss in species richness or in taxonomic diversity was only 19%. This is at the basin scale, by the way. This is at the gamma scale, so that's the whole basin. And the decline in functional richness was unfortunately more than 3.5 times stronger than the decline in species richness, which was kind of terrifying. And at the alpha scale, we found that without a single exception, all of the grid squares, all of our study squares, by the way, I forgot because I'm a little nervous. I forgot to tell you about our major study units were 50 by 50 kilometer grid squares. These are the UTM squares that are used in the bird atlases. So sorry about that. I've missed that. I've skipped that. So anyhow, the decline in alpha diversity, in taxonomic alpha diversity, was widespread. So without an exception, in all of the grid squares, we saw some declines. And the mean decline was 20 species per grid square. And the declines in functional alpha diversity simply mirrored the decline, and the differences were always significant. But things started to get a little tricky when we started studying the beta diversity. So to study beta diversity, we followed the seminal paper by Baselga and partitioned the total beta diversity into its turnover and nestedness components. And now I'll start with discussing the taxonomic beta diversity. be quantified, by the way, pairwise beta diversity. And we found that, by the way, now I'm focusing on the panel on the left. Here you see on the right, that's the total beta diversity. So there's an increase. So the communities, they're becoming more dissimilar. But the individual components, the turnover and nestedness components, they showed contrasting patterns. So we did see some increase in turnover resultant dissimilarity, while we saw a decline in nestedness resultant dissimilarity. And this does have some conservation implications. So we're losing the species all over the basin, but that's making the communities more heterogeneous. But this kind of heterogenization is not a good kind of heterogenization because it's happening via species loss. That is why it's called subtractive heterogenization. So this is what's happening. And given the fact that the communities are now less nested, this means that the remaining taxonomic diversity is distributed over a larger space. And now, in order to preserve the remaining diversity, we need to have larger scale planning. While in the past, we could have just preserved the same amount of taxonomic diversity by probably preserving just a couple of grid squares. So when we looked at the functional beta diversity, things got even more tricky. We saw that although the communities, although the nestedness resultant dissimilarity was decreasing taxonomically, it was increasing functionally. So the communities, they were becoming less nested taxonomically, but they were becoming more nested functionally. So this was a little bit intriguing. And we also, by the way, studied the distance decay of these dissimilarities, and we found that the heterogenization is stronger taxonomically, and it's a little bit weaker functionally. In order to explain the difference that we saw here in my previous slide, so our functional nestedness increasing and taxonomic decreasing, we did some simulations. And we found that one way to get that pattern, which is an interesting pattern, this can happen if we lose the most original species, the functionally most original species. So our communities, their volume is shrinking, but this shrinking occurring mostly due to the loss of functionally original species. And in this case, you can get the patterns that we just saw in the previous slide. And we also found that the communities that did have high functional diversity, actually we used another metric called functional dispersion. I don't want to go into details, but that's just another functional diversity metric showing how dispersed individual species are in the functional space. So the communities that did have high functional dispersion were the ones that showed the least compositional change. So this is in line with the expectations. So when we are marketing functional diversity, we say that if the communities that have, in theory, the communities that have high functional diversity should be are expected to be more stable. And we kind of found this. And when we looked at the individual functional traits, such as the timing of the breeding, we found that, like elsewhere on the planet, the late breeders were at a disadvantage. So the percentage of the species that were breeding later in the season, such as in May and June, we were losing them. So we saw a decline here, and we did see some increase in the percentage of the early breeders. So this was shown in other parts of the world with waterbirds. And these late breeders, they happen to be already endangered species, such as the white-headed duck. So this is the guy that's threatened by the ruddy duck that you have in the United States via hybridization. And then we also discovered something really interesting. Our lakes are shrinking in the region due to water abstraction to irrigate the crops. So we did see some declines, but we saw that the declines are even stronger later in the breeding season. Check out the satellite images that I have here. So I have here satellite images from a lake, that's 1998. And on the left, you're seeing on the left column, you're seeing the early breeding season, that's from April. And this is from August, the right column. Check out the differences. Check out the difference between the two here and the two here. So we found that the declines are actually stronger the difference between these two is stronger. So the declines in later during the breeding season, they are stronger. And we hypothesize that this is not good for the late breeders, such as the already threatened diving ducks, like white-headed ducks or common poachers. They're late breeders in our region. So what might be happening, this is just speculation, this is our hypotheses. So I have here a graph to explain our hypotheses. So diving ducks and the non-diving waterbirds, they share some food sources. And having spatial segregation is a common way to have some niche segregation in waterbirds. So these diving ducks, they have their exclusive depth feeding or foraging depth that they can use, and that's not accessible to the non-diving waterbirds. So they can use that exclusive depth range. But suppose that lakes are now shrinking in the middle of their breeding season. Now they're late breeders. This is happening right in the middle of their breeding seasons. Assume that lakes are becoming smaller and shallower. That will leave them with a smaller exclusive depth range that they can exploit. And that would, probably escalate any competition between the diving ducks and all of the non-diving waterbirds. So we think that this might be, a final nail on the coffin for these already threatened waterbirds, diving ducks. So this is just speculation, and if we're not, and this, to our best knowledge, this might be the first time this is being hypothesized. And when we looked at the individual functional traits, we found that the species that survived tended to be the ones that had higher relative brain mass. So the smarters are the survivors. And we did see some declines in reed nesting, for example. We're losing the reeds because we're losing the wetlands, and the remaining ones are now more saline. Reeds, they don't like saline water. And we did see some declines in foraging by diving, functional trait, because when you don't have water, you cannot have diving. And again, just like it's been shown elsewhere on the planet, we did see some declines in body mass. So the surviving species, they tended to be the smaller ones. But interestingly, we couldn't see any difference in terms of survival between the migratory and non-migratory species. So we couldn't find this. So migratory species, they didn't have any higher chance to go extinct. And again, interestingly, we found that having a high trait plasticity, such as diet plasticity or foraging substrate or foraging habitat plasticity, that didn't help, that they did not confer any advantage to their bears. We expected them to provide some advantage, but they unfortunately did not, which was quite interesting. And we will have in our paper some discussions, by the way. So we haven't submitted our work, by the way. And I'm already 1 minute late. With that said, I want to thank all my collaborators in Turkey and outside Turkey. And I also want to thank the wonderful people of Waterbird Society. Now, if you do have some questions, I'm ready to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Khan. Very interesting talk. If you have any questions, raise your hand, but I see Kate Schlepper has one in the chat. I'll read it out. It is neat that you compare diversity at different spatial scales. Is there any interest by landowners to make their crop fields more wildlife friendly?
Yeah, I would love if that happened, but what's happening here is our government, they've been supporting irrigated crops, which doesn't really make any sense at all. But the farmers, they're getting, some support, some financial support if they do plant irrigated crops. So I don't think, this will change anytime soon. So I wish that it could happen, but that won't happen, I think. So Erika said, is the loss of water from the lake from irrigation mostly? I think it's a combination of both, Erika. It's not just water abstraction for irrigation. So we did see some increases in pan evaporation also. So it's a combination of climate change plus water abstraction and also dam constructions. So yeah, that's not just that. Thanks for the questions. I think we still have some time. So if you do have some questions, some other. If not, I'll just stop my screen share.
Erica has, how did you measure brain size?
Brain size. So what we did is we did have, for a little bit more than 80% of our species, we did have the brain mass data and we had the body mass data. So we used the regression. We regressed brain mass on body mass. I don't know if that's the right way to say that. My English is now failing me. But we did have a linear regression to get rid of that correlation between the brain size and body size simply. And we used the residuals from our linear model, which had a quite high R-squared value. We did use the residuals from that model, which can be considered as, a relative measure of brain size. So that's how we measured the brain size.
Here comes another question. Sorry.
Yes. So should I answer? I have 1 more minute, or should I just write it in chat?
No. Juliet Lamb, do you think there are any changes in water quality, example, increases in salinity, contaminants, hypertrophia, associated with the water loss that might be affecting the waterbird community?
Well, I think there are many other studies, including one of my studies that have showed that, for example, increases in nutrient content, or when the lakes, when they become more eutrophic, that also affects these already endangered diving ducks, such as the common poachers and white-headed ducks, so that they have a negative impact. And for the salinity, I don't think there are any particular studies that only focused on salinity, so I cannot really talk about that. But eutrophication, that's a big problem. That also, when the lakes go eutrophic, many things changes especially in shallow lakes. Even it's a cascade. It even affects fish, and then the fish, they compete. There's fish like carps, they compete with these diving ducks over their food sources. So yes, and thank you for the great questions.
Great, thank you, Khan. Great presentation. Now our next presentation is going to be from Kyle Lloyd, and it's going to be on the white-winged flufftail conservation project and 3 decades of saving Africa's most threatened waterbird. I did watch your virtual field trip, Kyle. It was great. And if anyone else wants to watch it, they're all on the Drifta website. So take it away, Kyle.
Thanks, and you can hear me nicely?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Right, yeah, my name's Kyle Lloyd, and I'm the Rock Jumper Fellow of White-winged Flufftail Conservation at BirdLife South Africa. So while Rock Jumper and the Ngula Partnership do provide some of my salary, it's the Waterbird Society through the recent grant that has enabled the research that you'll see at the end of the presentation. So a big thank you to them. This is a project that has spanned 3 decades. I was born when this started, so there's a lot of people that have been involved, and I'd just like to acknowledge them as well. So yeah. Right, so the talk's sort of divided into 3 parts. I'll go through a brief history of the project. I'd also like to talk about our project philosophy or approach. This is conservation, and there's often an agenda attached to that and a philosophy or way of thinking. And then also just some of the project objectives. And when I do the project history, really what I'm hoping is that you'll see this more as a case study and maybe get some lessons out of it as well. So yeah, into part 1. So yes, the white-winged flufftail, it's one of 9 flufftail species endemic to sub-Saharan Africa. So this group of flufftails only occurs on the African continent and Madagascar as well. And the white-winged flufftail in particular has these diagnostic white secondary flight feathers, which give it its common name. The bird is also extremely cryptic in behavior, which has made it very difficult to study, resulting in knowledge gaps for a large amount of period of time. But however, what we do know is that the bird breeds in high altitude peat wetlands in the summer months, and that it is also a wetland specialist, preferring intact sedge meadows. There's some question about whether it is an intra-African migrant. The old hypothesis was that it bred in Ethiopia and overwintered in South Africa, but I'll show you why that is no longer the case. Well, that theory or hypothesis no longer has value. And it was also considered one of Africa's rarest birds. So if you are a bird watcher, a keen bird watcher, and you come to Africa, this was definitely a difficult one to tick. So I'm going to give you a broad sort of overview of the white-winged flufftail project through this timeline. So I've given you a bit of a species description, which the species was officially described to science in 1876. And over the remaining 100 years, I'm going to kind of focus on South Africa. The remaining 100 years, there's only been scattered records of the bird. So this map of Africa, you can see the bird's distribution. We have this these wetlands in these highlands of Ethiopia and scattered records in South Africa. There's 2 records from Zimbabwe in the 1970s, and this record from Zambia is under question. And then if you zoom into this map of South Africa, you can see a lot of the records are quite old, pre-2000. And focused along this eastern escarpment of South Africa. So this is a mountain range along here. What we have seen though over the years is a huge range contraction in the species distribution. And this is due to the destruction and degradation of wetlands. So wetlands have been threatened by various factors such as mining and water abstraction, agriculture, afforestation, grazing, pollution, peat fires, and human settlements. In fact, South Africa recently conducted a national biodiversity assessment and found that wetlands with estuaries are one of the most threatened and unprotected ecosystem types in South Africa. So they certainly warrant our concern. Then in 1992, the bird was seen regularly and consistently at a single site in South Africa by a group of passionate birders. This wetland was called Middelpunt Wetland. And in 1994, these group of birders formed the Middelpunt Wetland Trust. So this really is a citizen science initiative. And a lot of the foundational work of this project was started by this group. These people listed here are the current trustees. They meet biannually and discuss all things related to the wetland and the species. However, Middelpunt Wetland is still threatened by mining and agriculture in the surrounding landscape. It is a private cattle farm, so there's no nature reserve status attached to it. So we're really trying to improve that conservation status of the site. If you are fortunate to see a flufftail, this is probably all you'll get, is a little glimpse as it flies across the wetland sedge meadows. Then finally, in 1997, the first breeding records of the bird was made in Ethiopia. And yeah, some recent pictures of a female sitting on a nest. So she sort of weaves the sedge meadows, the leaves together. And apparently she will be quite dedicated on sitting on her eggs. You'll get up quite close and she'll still remain there. But this really has limited sort of the survey techniques, the more invasive techniques of flushing the bird, because you can very easily trample on nests and eggs, which has been recorded in the literature before. However, Ethiopia is not without its problems. So there's a rapidly growing human population, and with that encroachment of agriculture into wetlands, particularly overgrazing by livestock. So the Middelpunt Wetland Trust built a school in the community to sort of come to an agreement with them that they keep livestock out of the wetlands during the breeding period of the white-winged flufftail. And this has so far been successful. The white-winged flufftail then entered the international arena by being listed by the African Eurasian Migratory Waterbird Agreement, and when South Africa became a signatory to this agreement. So the African Eurasian Migratory Waterbird Agreement is an independent international treaty developed by the UN. And this, and AWA lists the white-winged flufftail in the Appendix 1, which is species with the highest level that necessitates protection. In 2008, a single species action plan was developed for the white-winged flufftail, and since then there have been several international working groups which have met to prioritize and discuss which aspects of this plan need to be implemented over a reporting period. BirdLife South Africa then entered the scene in 2011 when they were asked to administer the Middelpunt Wetland Trust. And the real focus there has been research. So we knew very little about the bird, which really impedes conservation. And some of the sort of insights that were made through research was looking at the bird's genetics. So it was found to have a very low adaptability to environmental change, suggesting that the species may have gone under population bottlenecks. It does seem that the bird is quite old as a species or as a lineage. It was one of the first to break away from the common flufftail ancestor. So it may have become very specialized to its habitat over time. We've also been able to develop passive monitoring ways of studying the bird. So these tunnels using shade cloth sort of mimic the wetland vegetation and help channel the bird through motion detected camera traps. And this has greatly improved the detection rate and allowed us to have insight into the bird's life and ecology. And it was also found through these techniques that the bird prefers these sedge meadows. The bird was then listed as globally critically endangered in 2013. And this really comes to the question of how many individuals are actually left. What are we looking at? So this is a very rough estimate based on what available habitat there is for the bird. It's thought that there are less than 250 individuals, but honestly, we don't really know. And that there's approximately 50 individuals in South Africa. However, a more robust study was recently conducted in this past year in Ethiopia using nest densities and home ranges. And it was found that the amount of habitat available in Ethiopia can only support 55 breeding pairs. So this critically endangered status is certainly warranted. Right, and then the world went crazy, or at least in the African ornithological world went crazy, when the first breeding records were found in South Africa and the bird's core was described for the first time 140 years after the species was described. So this is the famous picture. It's not very clear, but you can see here mother followed by chicks, and this was taken at Middelpunt Wetland, as well as pictures of fledglings. Right, going into part two, just talking about some of the philosophy or approach that we take to white-winged flufftail conservation. So ours is certainly one of adaptive management, where we have experimental learning through hypothesis testing. We then translate our applied research into best practice guidelines and implement this on the ground. We then monitor and quantify the success of this implementation and either refine it or reassess, or we upscale it to a national level. At least that's what we are trying to aim to achieve. And these are just some of the broad research questions that we are trying to look at in the next period, looking at population dynamics, giving more robust estimates to South Africa, the distribution, looking at movement, so where does it overwinter, and also describing more fine-scale habitat requirements of the bird and its surrounding community. And yeah, all of this is translated into best practice guidelines, as I mentioned, which we then give to landowners and practitioners. And the white-winged flufftail is also very much of a flagship species or ambassador species for wetland and water conservation. So while the conservation of the species is really important, we also need to look at wetlands as a whole. Habitat loss is one of the greatest pressures that the bird is facing, as well as a host of other wetland birds that are dependent on these intact, healthy wetland systems. So by conserving the bird, we also conserve water resources, we conserve wetland habitat for a range of other birds. It creates a platform to meet with other stakeholders, so landowners, farmers, provincial and national governments. It all brings us to the same table to talk. It also creates a it's a charismatic species, so it allows us to engage with the public through these annual Flufftail festivals. It's really aimed at school children, but also the general public. So where are we in the recovery of the white-winged flufftail? This is just a fictitious graph taken from the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. It sort of illustrates the kind of pathway you take for the conservation of the species. And as I mentioned, we've done a lot of groundwork, or at least my colleagues have, in terms of diagnosing the problem. But there are still significant knowledge gaps that remain. But we are finding ourselves at this transition point where we're starting to implement stuff on the ground. Right, part 3, and yeah, there are a lot of research objectives we're trying to achieve, but these are just a few of them, just to talk about some of the most important. So obviously we want to find out where is the white-winged flufftail, which wetlands are the most important to prioritize, to feed back into management plans. So we're taking both the historical sites of the bird as well as a habitat suitability model based on the broad habitat requirements of the white-winged flufftail. And these layers include things like protected area status, just so that we know the degradation of the ecosystem as well. What are we looking at? We then are able to pinpoint and identify areas and then go in with acoustic devices, now that we know the bird's call, and determine where the bird is. A very direct or application of this is when we meet as South Africa. We have various stakeholders. We have a national working group for the white-winged flufftail. And as BirdLife South Africa, we present this tool to the various stakeholders that are present. So we list the wetlands where we have found the white-winged flufftail recently. We list the people who are responsible for the management of that wetland. And we also propose actions that can improve the conservation status of those sites. Another one is protected area expansion. So using legislation to protect sites. So yeah, I'm based here at the Greater Larkenvlei Protected Environment. But yes, we also have protected sites and stewardship offices all along this eastern escarpment of South Africa. So we've currently just finished doing site assessments for the Greater Larkenvlei Protected Environment to expand the reserve. You can see the map on the left. This sort of light brown is what the current protected environment looks like, but there's a lot of wetland systems to cover as we expand that. And what protected environment is a way of sort of formally agreeing with a landowner or farmer to conserve biodiversity on their land, to use best practice guidelines, to take conservation into mind when they make decisions. We also want to, as I said, formally declare Middelpunt wetland as a nature reserve. And we're also even looking at Ramsar as another option. In terms of on-site management of Middelpunt wetland, given that this is the only confirmed breeding site in South Africa and the Southern Hemisphere, we really want to work with the landowners and really be involved on the ground. So we're looking at the effects of cattle. There's cattle trampling annually at the wetland. So we're looking to raise enough funds to put a wetland wildlife friendly fence into the wetland. So we're trying to design it to keep cattle out, but allow wild ungulates to still move in and maintain those ecosystem processes that keep a wetland going. So that will be monitored with camera traps once that's up and running, and then that can feed into guidelines. We also want to establish annual fire breaks along the wetland. So there's been runaway fires happening in the winter months, and that's really, these intense dry winter fires can really damage the peat bed, can even start burning down deep into the peat layer. So we really want to prevent that and start just improving the management of that site. Yeah, that's it really. There's a lot more you can visit our website where there's several social media posts and previous webinars. We can find out more specifically talking to stewardship or specifically to research. If you'd like to find out more, you're also welcome to contact me. Yeah, and so thank you very much for allowing me to talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kyle. That was a great presentation. I'm going to follow up to the field trip. A lot more details. If anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand or type it in the chat. If no one does it, I do have a question. I saw you were going to be looking at movements of the white-winged flufftail. How are you going to be doing that with tracking devices?
Yeah, so the movement's sort of divided into fine scale movements. So within a wetland, that will be using color bands on the flufftail, hopefully, if we can manage to capture them. And then resites with the camera trap so we can track movement because it's likely that that movement fluctuates with rainfall patterns throughout the season. The sort of broad scale movement, yeah, tracking device. So the big limitation there is size. So we need to be ethically viable. The device needs to be less than 1 gram. We have no idea where the bird goes. We have no idea if there's site fidelity. So it's really a challenge to find a powered GPS device small enough to get it on a white-winged flufftail. So once we have questions answered, like do the birds, return to the same site in summer, then and can we actually catch them? Then we can start looking at things like, like geologgers or something like that, something that doesn't require, upload onto a satellite onto my, laptop. I can retrieve the device and get the data. So that's to come. Yeah.
Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, it sounds like a geolocator would fit that, or maybe a radio tag, but radio tags aren't as detailed as a geolocator would be for the out of the wetland movement.
Yeah, no, thanks. Yeah, another problem is they travel at night, we think. And they're in a dense understory of a sedge meadow. How does that affect light? So it's a lot of these, this is a very tricky bird. Yeah, but fun and quite a privilege to study it. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, doesn't look like we have any other questions, so we can move on to the next presentation. It's going to be given by Lindsay Herman on the survivorship of a migratory long-distance Arctic breeding shorebird, working to improve adult survival estimates of arcticola dunlin. So this is Lindsay's first Waterbird Society she's presenting at, and she's a master's student at Virginia Tech. Studying fish and wildlife conservation. All right, you can go ahead, Lindsay.
Okay, great. Can everyone hear me, and is my screen sharing?
Yes and yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for the introduction. First and foremost, I would like to acknowledge that our research was performed on the land of Inupiat Indigenous peoples, and we thank them for our ability to learn and work on their lands in Utqiagvik and the surrounding areas. And with that, we'll get into it. This might not come as a surprise to many of us, but climate change and anthropogenic effects have the potential to negatively affect avian populations. For example, due to these changes, shorebird species have declined roughly 40% over the last 50 years. These declines extend to my study species, the arcticola dunlin. This subspecies breeds in northern Alaska and Canada, arriving in May and departing in early August. They then travel along the East Asian, Australasian flyway to their non-breeding grounds. And their non-breeding distribution is centered around the Yellow Sea, Taiwan, and Japan. So as I just mentioned, the arcticola populations are declining, with it's estimated that their population is roughly at 500,000 individuals. And there have been a few studies looking at survival rates of this subspecies. The first one estimated apparent survival, and this study used smart capture and recapture data collected from one study site in the Arctic to estimate survival rates across an 8-year time period. And you can see that the results are that the males had a higher survival rate of 0.60, and females had the lower survival rate at 0.41, and these are annual apparent survival rates. The second study estimating true survival found that this subspecies had a survival rate of 0.54. They did use similar methods, mark capture, recapture data, but they incorporated a dispersal distance in order to try to account for emigration and immigration from the study site. And dispersal distance, I'll just define it as how far an individual moves annually from its first capture location. The second study also estimated survival rates of other sympatric breeding shorebirds in the area. And this includes other subspecies of dunlin, which they found their survival rate to be at 0.95. So you can see that's quite a difference in the survival rates between even other subspecies of dunlin and this one. And both of these estimates are low for a species where adult survival can have large consequences on population growth rates. Both studies also looked at some breeding ground ecological and environmental variables, but found that none significantly impacted survival rates. So what they both concluded is that there must be something going on with the flyway at the flyway level for the subspecies. A lot of shorebird species that breed in the Arctic will use the American flyways. However, this subspecies of dunlin uses the East Asian Australasian flyway, which is undergoing massive development, habitat loss, and it's actually experiencing the sharpest declines of shorebird species as compared to all other flyways. So here I am a few years later, asking somewhat of the same questions, but I have a little bit more to work with as far as data. So our objective for this study was to assess the long-term trends in adult survival of this subspecies and compare the old estimates to our new estimates to see if this extra data would make any sort of difference. What that means is we have data from 2003 till now available to us to use. And we also have data that's derived from the breeding site and also the non-breeding site. And with this, we want to look at, we want to examine and see if this low survival rate is due to undetected dispersal. Again, that individual moving further from its initial capture location every year. So we're just not accounting for individuals. We want to see if it has something to do with the cyclic annual variation. Maybe we're just seeing a really small snapshot of the bigger picture, and when we incorporate this new data, we'll see that maybe the survival rates fluctuate annually or by some temporal variation. And then maybe we're actually just looking at a persisting low survival for the subspecies. We also want to examine some additional variables on the breeding grounds, including things like snow cover, precipitation, temperature, invertebrate abundance, predator abundance, sex, and morphological measurements, which are an indicator of body condition. A study site is located in Utqiagvik, Alaska. It's in the high Arctic, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been conducting shorebird breeding ecology studies here since 2003. They've been monitoring these nest plots that are outlined in black on this map. And I was there in 2019 and 2021 to continue this research. The primary habitat is tundra. So it's kind of mosaic-y, marshy lowlands and uplands. And all this habitat is created through freeze-thaw processes. This habitat is also very ideal for a post-field day nap. And when we first get to Utqiagvik, our main goal is to recite as many individuals as possible before they pair up and start to disperse along the breeding grounds. And when they start to lay, we attempt to capture or recapture them with a bow net. And when we do capture them, or if we do capture them, we color band them and give them an alphanumeric field readable flag in order to distinguish one individual from another. We also have some additional recite data collected along the migratory pathway and non-breeding grounds. So individuals that were previously captured at Utqiagvik were recited by volunteers, and we graciously thank in China, Taiwan, and Japan. And this has resulted in 150 recites since 2003. And now I'll talk to you about the analytical methods and the two approaches that we use to model survival for the subspecies. The first approach we took was to use captures, recaptures, and recites of arcticola dunlin from the breeding grounds up there. And we applied this to a Cormac jelly seabird model, which looks at apparent survival, so similar to that first study that we discussed in the introduction. The second approach we took was to use the ancillary recites, or those non-breeding ground recites, and incorporate those with the capture, recapture, and recites from the breeding grounds, and use the Barker model to estimate a form of true survival. We used data from 2003 to 2018. 976 total individuals were banded. 1,796 breeding site recites were obtained, as well as those 152 non-breeding site recites. We then created a capture history for each individual and ran our models in RMark. First, I'll talk about the in-depth methods for the Cormac jelly seabird model, which is predicting apparent survival. It's predicting two different parameters, detection P and survival phi. And this model gives us an apparent survival rate because it's not accounting for emigration or immigration from the study site. So first we ran a set of basic models, and the top model from this set was incorporated into the next model set, which looked at environmental variables. And the top model from this set was again incorporated into the next set of models, looking at individual covariates. We ran a goodness fit test on our most fully parameterized model, and our data ended up being slightly over dispersed. And here you can see the results from that model set with apparent survival, or phi, being best predicted by year plus sex, and then detection or the recite being best predicted by sex. And here's a visual of that where you can see I have year along the bottom and then annual survival along the y-axis. We found that there was a difference between male and female survival rates, and that also we had some pretty intense annual variation. And here you can see our estimates as compared to the previous estimates. Our estimates are a bit higher than previous estimates for the same model. However, you can still see that females have that low survival rate, or lower survival rate than males in both cases. And next I'll talk to you about the Barker model, which uses those off-site recites. It attempts to estimate quite a few parameters, and these are preliminary results, so you have to bear with me as I talk my way through it here. So out of all these parameters, the ones that we're most focused on at this point is S, or true survival, and then also P, the recite at the study site. And here is our really long list of factors that we chose to incorporate into our model set. And here are the results of that, with true survival being best predicted by year and recite being best predicted by year. If we look at that in comparison to the previous model, the Cormac jelly seabird model that we ran, here's that visual again with year on the bottom and then annual survival rate on the y-axis. There's the previous estimates of the Cormac jelly seabird, or apparent survival. And now we can compare those results to the Barker model, or true survival rate. And you can see that they're higher in every instance across the board here. You will also note that there's only one bar symbolizing the Barker model. That's because there was no significant effect of sex. So it's estimating for both males and females. It's also, we also found that we were quite a bit higher than previous true survival rates of 0.54 at an average of 0.71, which might be good news. So if we look at both of these models in the context of comparison, the Cormac Jolly seabird or apparent survival predicted higher rates than previous studies, with that annual variation across the study period and the difference between the sexes. So this annual variation might be explained by other temporally driven variables that we haven't explored yet, as we did look at breeding site, ecological and environmental variables, and none significantly impacted the survival rate. And the annual variation might stem from time-varying processes on the migratory pathway. For example, the use of the dunlins, the arcticola dunlins, their use of that flyway that's undergoing some massive changes right now might be driving some sort of temporal variation in our survival rates. The difference between male and female survival can likely be explained by females dispersing farther from their initial capture location every year, and other similar sympatric shorebird species, 59 to 90% of males, as compared to 20 to 54% of females, return to the same breeding site. So hypothetically, males are showing a higher site fidelity to that area. And using the Barker model, we predicted a higher survival rate, as you might expect, since it does account for those offsite resites. And compared with previous estimates of true survival at 0.54, perhaps the subspecies might be existing at a rate that's stable enough for the population right now. However, if you recall, way back in the beginning, I mentioned that other dunlin subspecies have a survival rate of 0.95. So we're still kind of lacking. And again, that could be driven by a difference in flyway use or something that we haven't explored yet. We did see the annual variation in the Barker model. Again, could be potentially explained by breeding site variables or non-breeding site variables that we haven't explored yet. And these results kind of emphasize the importance of continuing research so we better understand what's impacting survival so we can focus our conservation efforts appropriately. Moving forward, a few things that we'd like to do in order to refine these estimates is conduct some dispersal surveys along the breeding grounds, look into mate and site fidelity and see how that factors into survival, and look at those other additional unexplored variables that we haven't added to our models yet. And we also want to take a look at the flyway and see if we can quantify some sort of habitat change, human development, or climatic variables, and see if that changes our survival predictions at all. And also, we would love to keep getting those resites from volunteers along the flyway. This definitely could not have been possible without all these people and more. Thank you very much to the Waterbird Society for, I guess, allowing me to present some of my research. And I will take any questions.
Thank you, Lindsay. Great presentation. Looks like we already have a question in the chat from Jeff Spendolo. Nice study, nicely done. What sort of models were used to get those extremely high 0.95 survival rates of the other subspecies of dunlin?
Yeah, good question. So that study was done and it used those 9 Arctic sites. And I believe the models that were used were a Cormac Jolly seabird model. So it's apparent survival. However, they also use that dispersal distance. So in a way, it can kind of account for the emigration and immigration from the study site. If you're interested, I can give you the title of the paper. I've read it a lot.
All right, there's another question from Erica Knoll. Hi, Lindsay, thanks for great talk. I'm wondering how many of these resites, 152 on the non-breeding, were from the Yellow Sea?
Great question. I believe we had one. And that could be because it's not quite as popular. We get most of our resites from Japan and Taiwan. And of course, those areas are heavily populated, so we would expect to get more resites from that area. But there's one resite that's along the Yellow Sea.
Thank you.
I have a question, actually. Did you find any differences in the non-breeding resites by sex?
There is a study that's done on that, and no, they're pretty like evenly dispersed throughout the non-breeding grounds. Are you asking if they're like selecting different areas?
Yeah, if the females are in a different spot than the males, to explain
Yeah.
that difference in survival rate.
Yeah, that's a great question. And from what I can remember, the study didn't come up with any significant difference between the two and where they settled.
Okay, thank you. Looks like if there's no more questions, we could probably move on to the next presentation. I did see that Susan Elbin had a question for Kyle, our last presenter, that we didn't get to. So Kyle, if you don't mind answering that in the chat. Oh, and we do have one more from Erica, actually. So what do you think is the better method, taking into account dispersal as per Weiser et al. Or your method?
I think that looking at the resites and using the Barker model can really bolster your survival rate, because if you're just estimating that a bird is leaving your study site, you don't actually know if it's alive or not. But if you are not seeing a bird at your breeding site, at your study site, and you don't see it for several years, but you're seeing it on the non-breeding grounds, like that's like a solid piece of information that can help with the survival rate estimation. I feel like they probably have their own merit, you know, each of them, but I hope that answered your question.
Right. Thank you, Lindsay. Great presentation. So our next presentation is going to be by Jennifer Wheeler. It's called "Now That We Know So Much More, Updating the Diablotin Conservation Plan." I hope I pronounced that right. You should be able to share your screen and you can take it away.
All right, let me do that. Share sound, optimize, share. Okay, are people seeing my presentation? Coming through okay?
Yep, we can hear you and we can see it.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you for the introduction. And actually it is Diablotin, but that's okay. I'll explain where the word comes from. But first, hi, everybody. It's really nice to see you. Missing a lot of you and your faces. So it's great to be here, at least virtually. So the International Black-Capped Petrel Conservation Group is a collaborative association of organizations and individuals with a shared interest in the conservation of the species throughout its range. And recently, the group experienced a milestone. It updated the Species Conservation Action Plan. And to us, that's headline news because it was a lot of work and we think we made a lot of breakthroughs. So I'm a co-chair of the international group, and on behalf of the others in the core planning team, I'd like to present this new plan. We think that it's an intriguing species, but also hope that the elements of our planning process could be illustrative or useful to other planners out there. First, species. Diablotin translates as little devil. And it's one of the common names of the black-capped petrel, Teardroma hasitata, which is a seabird endemic to the Caribbean. It's a pelagic seabird. That means it spends its life at sea and comes to land only to breed under the cover of darkness. So that name Diablotin came from these sort of haunting calls or wails that it would make in the night, and which spooked the European and African settlers in the Caribbean. All known nesting sites of the Diablotin are in mountainous areas above 2,000 meters in an understory of montane forest. They nest underground in limestone cavities or burrows excavated in the soil or under tree roots. And the topography at all the known sites is generally very steep ravines and canyons. To date, the only nests have only been located on the island of Hispaniola, which is the island comprising Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Historic records and recent surveys suggest probable nesting populations in Dominica and other areas of Hispaniola, as well as suspected populations in Guadeloupe, Cuba, and Jamaica. The species marine range extends into the western North Atlantic, the Caribbean Sea, and thanks to recent data, the Gulf of Mexico. And at sea, the black-capped petrel associates with upwellings or eddies, in particular those associated with the Gulf Stream. And based on the concentrations seen at sea and the available suitable habitat, there's a very rough guess of 2,000 pairs of black-capped petrels in the world. However, that is a number with a lot of uncertainty. But based on its history, its current numbers, and its limited distribution to just a few sites, it is considered endangered on the IUCN list. So here's a quick visual. The species range. These big blobs are various depictions about the marine range. As I've mentioned, information recently has emphasized that it really is present in significant numbers in the Gulf. This area off of the southeast US is considered a hotspot, a marine hotspot. And it extends again, to the western North Atlantic and down in the Caribbean Sea. And then here in the middle of the graphic are the islands. We have the Greater Antilles, Cuba and Jamaica and Hispaniola, and then down in the Lesser Antilles, Dominica and Guadeloupe. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about the conservation profile of the species. So this was a bird, according to historic records, widespread and hugely abundant in areas of the Caribbean. But once humans got there and brought their introduced predators, those numbers plummeted. They were extensively harvested. And they think that certain natural disasters like hurricanes or landslides might have finished them off in certain sites. So we have a little timeline down at the bottom of the screen, and it shows that up until the 1800s, it was pretty much gone and considered extinct. But in 1963, it was rediscovered in Haiti by a very determined biologist from Bermuda. That happened, and yet decades passed, and the bulk of the new findings were out at sea. That marine hotspot I mentioned was found, and numerous expeditions were launched to probable or promising islands. But it wasn't until 40 years later that the first nest was actually identified, found. And that was great, and yet still not too much happened for several years until a biologist by the name of Jim Getz started listening for them in Haiti. And worlds collided, and so a group of people formed this international black-capped conservation group that I mentioned and held an international workshop. And we think that that combination of international interest and launching in-country focus by some local partners, notably Grupo Jaragua in the Dominican Republic, launched just a cascade of exciting findings. So 2011, The first chick was located, 3 nests were located that year, and that began a dedicated search and monitoring program, which continues today. Marine radar surveys were conducted on various islands, Hispaniola first, and that gave us a number of really promising leads, which were supplemented by acoustic recording units to pinpoint locations. Once we found birds, we could start working with local communities. Specifically, this happened on the border of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. We started individual at-sea tracking with geolocators, followed by satellite transmitters. Those radar surveys were conducted on other islands. And now we have over 100 nests located on Hispaniola, and we're starting to undertake some direct threat management like predator control, among other things. And also I wanted to note some new tools, habitat modeling, and not shown here, but population viability analysis. But I say all this just to say that our first conservation plan in 2012 was before we had any of these breakthroughs. So it was based on many, many, many assumptions and lacking in specificity. So, because we've gained all this information, it was time to refine our vision, goals, and actions. But really specifically, once we know where there are petrels and we know where they are, it gives us opportunities to study the threats and implement management actions. So actually do something to save the species. As I mentioned, our previous plan was very general. The threats were hypothetical. So we wanted to assess the relative importance of various threats, articulate the factors that drove these threats, and share our assumptions about the ways we could counteract them. We wanted to be more explicit in our measures of conservation success and employ these new tools, including habitat suitability and population viability modeling. And finally, we wanted an updated plan to generate products which could excite and engage new partners and supporters. And I should mention that, you know, this is something we've been wanting to do for many years, but it was the time and the money to get together, to pull together partners from across continents that just prevented us from doing this. We kept postponing, and then a global pandemic hit. And ironically, it was the restrictions on travel that allowed us to find the time to meet. So our core planning team from far-flung places met virtually for each week for 8 months, and putting together almost 60 hours together. Plan was kind of all-encompassing. We just had a menu of all strategies, and to become more strategic, we're looking for a process that would help us to get more specificity. So we chose to use the open standards for the practice of conservation. Hereafter, I'm going to call it the conservation standards. And it's a framework that supports conservation decision-making. It's brought to us by an international partnership called the Conservation Measures Partnership. And it's supported by a network of coaches and trainers that aggregate under the name the CCNet. We liked how the conservation standards drove us to a systematic sharing of assumptions. It really forced us to talk. So that's how we spent 60 hours talking and really explaining ourselves and our ideas and our assumptions. And I'm going to expand on those dialogues and also our new criteria in a moment. But before that, I also want to say that conservation standards encourages pretty meticulous record keeping and provides a software called Marathi, which allows you to put things into graphic form. So you'll be seeing examples of that as I proceed. Oh, I do want to mention one other thing is, just as we got started, the core planning team formally signed an MOU for data sharing, and we felt that that provided an increased level of comfort, even among a group that was already well established in being cooperative and collaborative. All right, so goals and measures of success. In 2012, we did have a goal, and I'll read it to you. It's the ensure the long-term survival and stable population of black-capped petrel, whose conservation status has improved from endangered to near threatened on the IUCN Red List. That essentially was punting, because we knew we wanted the criteria for the Red List, abundance, distribution, trend, to get better, but we really just didn't have any metrics for incremental success. So we needed other goals. And this time around, we used the conservation standards approach of developing key ecological attributes. And these are aspects of a target's biology or ecology that define its health. We identified 7 different key EAs that relate to demographic parameters such as population size, productivity, survival, and to nesting habitat, distribution, intactness, and management. And then using the best available information, which often was guesses, we assigned levels of target health. So with these key EAs and these levels, indicator levels, it basically gives us a monitoring plan for the species and a way of saying we're making progress. In 2012, relative importance of all these threats, which were actually undocumented. They still have very little data. They were all suspected. So after a decade of observation, we were able to do a more in-depth analysis. We used the recommended simple threats rating system within the Marathi software, and you use that to assign a 4-level scale: high, medium, very high, high, medium, low, to criteria of scope, severity, and irreversibility. And all combined, this gives you a nicely color-coded rating scheme that allows you to really see where and what are the highest threats. To supplement our threats analysis, we also employed a meta population viability analysis program that was specifically designed for seabirds in the University of Santa Cruz Conservation Action Lab. And talking about the population viability analysis can take up a whole nother presentation, but suffice it to say, it really helped us understand the probable outcomes of various threat abatement scenarios. And it gave us an appreciation of the level and length of time of effort that will be needed to secure the petrel population. Model, it's basically our way of graphically depicting what we think is happening. The green indicates the target. So these are petrels at specific nesting sites. The red indicates the threat to those petrels, and the orange is what's causing those threats. And interventions or strategies can come in at all levels. You can do an intervention at the point of the direct threat, so reducing predation. You can do interventions on something that drives the threat, like land management practices. You can intervene right at the target, such as seabird restoration, reintroductions, things like that. And then there are strategies, the whole field of strategies that just make the whole situation better. So they kind of enable the whole conservation scenario. Conceptual models can get very complex. Here's an example of one that depicts what we think the situation on the Haitian border with the Dominican Republic involves. So there's a whole lot of human issues, local communities, our subsistence farming right up to the edge of habitat. And as you know, when integrating the needs of local communities, things get very complex. Down at the bottom of the conceptual model, you see a very short little chain to deal with predators. Predators are less complex. You just get rid of them and things get better. Once we had all these interventions in our minds, we had to explain to each other how we thought they would really work. So what we have are theories of change, and these are a series of causally linked assumptions about how the interventions or strategies are going to result in intermediate results and then ultimately threat reductions. And these are intended, the reason you have these diagrams is it's intended to make assumptions clear, allow discussions of uncertainty, and entertain varying opinions. So this is really where a proponent of a strategy has to make a case, and all the critics of the strategy get to pick it apart. As I mentioned, the theory of change or results chain for predation is pretty simple. So here's an example of what that looks like, just to give you a sense of the complexity. Model for strategies that involve engaging local communities. So again, with people, it's much more complex. So of all these interventions, how do we pick among them? Well, it's easier to drop strategies as being ineffective or infeasible. Like, we cannot remove Haitian farmers from the landscape. It leads to violence and it's inhumane. Some have to be deferred because we just don't know enough. We have to learn a lot more about other sites before we can begin to work on threats. And then some threats are just beyond our ability to manage. Our group is not going to be cleaning up ocean plastic, although we know that's a threat. So it's easier to drop, it's harder to pick among. So we came up with some criteria involving what we thought the impact of the various interventions would be and how feasibility, financially, technically, organizationally, ethically. And so we applied these to each of our strategies in various locations. Each team member undertook a rating and then we combined. And then we also, for those that address a threat, we considered the level of threat as a way of determining which strategies were really paramount. So I know you've been waiting with me. And there were 9 different strategies that we are promoting. Some are well underway, some are just in preliminary stages, and some have yet to be started. Some of these are higher than the others, and we call that paramount, higher ranking or rating. But ultimately, we believe all are necessary to ensure the viability of the species. Our population viability analysis showed this. So really quickly, without any detail, I'll just say that we must enable conservation by building up local capacity and finding the birds. It's really incredibly hard to find these birds, and we're still at it. Another enabling strategy would be to begin to explore the cutting edge world of seabird restoration, actual translocation into safe sites. There are predators at every location that petrels are found, and those must be dealt with. The world is full of flight hazards that petrels, especially when lighted, are attracted to, and there are collisions and groundings. And there's a number of at-sea threats that need to be brought to the world's attention. Finally, we have 3 strategies that are very specific to locations. I mentioned the work on the border. There's a village called Bukanshat, which has a stable population and a system of governance. So we're working with them to try to protect habitat. At another very important site called La Visite, we don't really even know all the factors driving it. So we just need to go there with a scoping study. And then finally, all the sites in the Dominican Republic are in national parks. And so we have to work with the main stakeholder or decision maker for the parks, which is the Dominican Republic government. So finally, if you want to read it, it's 168 pages. We have a huge plan document. It was a lot of work, despite Maradi giving us all those graphics. We still had to do a lot of documentation. We have a very big document. It's available on the website. I really want to thank Yvonne Satje, whose name I've double spelled there, who helped pull it all together, and Deborah Reynolds from Fish and Wildlife Service, who designed it, and the many people that provided images. But we're going to break this down into things that are much more useful. We've designed it so you can pull out site profiles to share or produce summaries, especially more graphic summaries for lay audiences. And finally, village, and there was many people that are working on the species and are making this all possible. And of course, I'd like to thank the Waterbird Society for giving me the opportunity to present. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. We're a bit over time, so if there are any questions, please put them in the chat and Jennifer can answer them or on the Slack channel.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Paige Byerly. She'll be presenting the current status and population trends of resident and migratory seabirds in the Virgin Islands. She is also our new managing editor for the Waterbird Society, which is very exciting. Please welcome her, and yeah, go ahead, Paige. You can share your screen and begin.
All right, sorry everyone, minor technical difficulties. There we go. Can you see my screen?
We sure can.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks so much to Waterbird Society for having me. It's great to be here and to be following Jen's great presentation, talking some more about Caribbean seabird conservation. So this is sort of data that was compiled during my time as a PhD student at the University of Louisiana. So I'm not based in the Virgin Islands. And so I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Susan, Daniel, and Judy, who all work in or have worked in seabird research in the Virgin Islands, and are really, their expertise is really the, is what resulted in this presentation today. So it's kind of refreshing to preach to the choir here when I say that seabirds are a group that is in rather drastic and rapid decline. So a group of major conservation concern. Over 43% of populations appear to be actively declining due to a myriad of causes, many of which we've heard during the talks of the last 3 days. And seabirds are also relatively understudied. So only about 19% of populations are actively monitored, or as of the time of the study at 2015, and most of these are based in temperate regions, and that's slightly in line with the bias in ecology we tend to see towards temperate versus more tropical locations. And that's a real issue because monitoring data is really critical information for effective conservation planning. It's not only needed as a baseline to establish population statuses, but it's also needed as reporting to gain funding and to gain actual research sort of capacity and to make kind of a case for research needs. So monitoring data is really crucial in seabird conservation. And so I'm going to be talking a bit about long-term monitoring, and that's just, as it would suggest, monitoring over a long period, so data that's collected regularly, annually. So seabirds are a very mobile taxa, obviously. Most are phylopathic, so they return to the same colony site every year, but they still have high dispersal potential, and there's a lot of variation, not only within species, but even within populations. And some species don't breed every year. So individuals might opt out of breeding in years following years of poor condition. And that's particularly true in the tropics, where we seem to see that species don't, or individuals don't necessarily breed every year and may not even return to the colony site where they are counted. Because of that, long-term monitoring provides a better analysis of population estimates versus snapshot surveys, where we might go out every 10 years or 5 years and count birds. It's much better to have this long-term annually collected data in order to establish population trends, because there is such variation in colony attendance annually. But this long-term monitoring data is obviously very expensive to collect. It requires a lot of resources, a lot of research capacity. And this just isn't a possibility for many, many regions, including the one I'm going to talk about today. When collecting long-term monitoring data, rigor is really important. So you're looking at consistency of survey methods, of data collectors, of incorporating things like detection estimates to account for error. All of these are really important for this monitoring data collection because it's needed to make accurate statistical analyses of population trends. But here I'm kind of making the case that lack of this rigorous data, and this data we've kind of come to expect in research, in ecological research, should not necessarily preclude the use of existing data for updating population statuses. And this is particularly true for kind of data deficient regions like the tropics, So where this long-term monitoring data has not been able to be collected, we are arguing that it's still really important to use whatever data we have to establish population statuses. And so today I'm talking about the Virgin Islands. This is a region comprised of 2 territories, so a US and British territory, and it's an archipelago of about 60 plus small islands and keys, so a ton of little islands making up this chain. Historically, there are about 15 to 17 breeding seabird species in this region. This is an area of really high tourism, particularly really high marine tourism. So it has this strong culture of sailing tourism, which means that there is a ton of boat traffic around these little islands and keys. Resources are managed separately between the 2 territories. And that's kind of interesting because these territories are really close together. So in the photo you're looking at, I am standing in the US Virgin Islands, and the little island off the point there is US Virgin Islands, and then everything beyond it is the British Virgin Islands. So these are really close territories. They clearly share natural resources, share this marine environment, and share seabird populations, but they don't share sort of this management methodology. And in addition, for all these tiny islands, there's really a mosaic of protection and ownership. So some are privately owned, some are managed by territory government or closed as national parks, but some are completely open and are not really managed at all. And so that can make it challenging working between all these islands. And so there are a lot of management challenges for this region. In addition to just some of the logistical things I mentioned, seabirds in this area sort of differ across life histories. So some may have multiple breeding seasons per year and even asynchronous breeding where they are extending the breeding period over several months versus other species that have this tight compacted breeding season we might tend to expect for seabirds. These colony sites can be really hazardous to access depending on the season. So this is a typical nesting island below. These aren't the flat sandy keys you might think of in the tropics. These are really steep, rocky and unvegetated sort of cliffy areas, and they're surrounded by coral reefs. So in the winter when seas are big, it's really hard to get on these islands. And the result is that there just hasn't been consistent monitoring in this region, and that's apart from even lack of resource availability. And so currently published records for this region do not reflect the accurate status for a lot of seabird species in this area. And there is no existing temporal comparison of trends for a lot of the species in this area. So that's a real issue when it comes to talking about seabird conservation in the BI. So we had some goals for this paper, this talk, and that was really to compile published population estimates from 2000 on in the US and British Virgin Islands. So these are published records and they're not necessarily reflected of the time period in which they were published. So you can kind of think of them as covering a range from late 80s to early 90s to the 2000s. And then in addition to this published data, we conducted surveys for 7 focal colonial seabird species over a multi-year period. And we did that to establish current baseline population abundances. So actually collecting rigorous data that can now be used as a baseline to make comparisons into the future. And then we wanted to compare these temporal data points to evaluate qualitative population trends of seabirds in the Virgin Islands. So this is not a data heavy talk. We are not able to make quantitative analyses of population trends because these data were not collected in the same way, as I'll mention, and some of the counts represent a range. However, based on expert opinion, this is a sort of a qualitative assessment of population status. So I've separated these 7 species into 2 groups, resident and migratory species. This isn't necessarily the most biologically relevant grouping because a lot of these species have different life histories and different foraging strategies. However, I think the really important differentiation here is that the resident species are present in the islands year round and they have multiple breeding seasons. So they have 2 peaks, but they tend to kind of breed throughout the year. And they're present in the Virgin Islands in the fall and winter, which is when we see some of the greatest sea surface temperature warming. So they're really experiencing some of the greater climate change effects in this region. And so that's brown pelicans, brown boobies, red-footed boobies, and masked boobies. Okay. And then we have our migratory species. So these have 1 breeding season, a very contracted breeding season, as we'd expect from terns. These are all terns. They're only present on the islands for about 3 to 4 months out of the year. And this is the roseate tern, the sandwich tern, and the royal tern. So to kind of analyze these published counts, or compile these published counts rather, we looked at 8 published records dating from 2000 to 2020. These data in these records were collected with a mix of survey types, as I mentioned. So some of these are derived from direct nest counts, but some are from boat-based estimates where people cruised by the islands and counted birds they could see. And some represent ranges compiled from long-term temporal counts that have not themselves been published, so just the ranges published, and from best knowledge estimates from researchers in the area. So this real mix of data types, however, it does kind of represent best understanding of seabird population estimates for the time periods that they were published. And we can compare that to our contemporary counts. So for resident species between 2016 and 2018, we conducted counts at 3 peak periods between November and August. And that's to account for these 2 laying peaks for these 4 resident species. So we surveyed 6 islands for boobies and 4 for brown pelicans. These species are really phylopatric in the Virgin Islands, and we've never seen them breeding off of these islands that we look for them at. And population estimates were conducted as nest counts. And so results are presented as number of breeding pairs. Brown pelicans were counted by boat, and that's because in the Virgin Islands, brown pelicans are somewhat arboreal, so they're nesting in trees on steep cliffs that's very hard to access. And so we count them by cruising slowly by and counting all the nests we can see. So chicks, eggs, adults on nests, etc. And boobies were counted by directly entering colonies, flushing adults, and then counting all nests. So the total count results I'm presenting here are combined peak estimates from each nesting island for each year. For migratory species, we counted royal and sandwich terns from 2016 to 2018. Again, these species are pretty phylopatric in the Virgin Islands. They also nest only in kind of shared colonies, so we counted them together. And we can contrast that to roseate terns. So roseate terns are the only species that breeds in our colonial seabird species in the area that's a species of extreme conservation concern. So they're classified as federally threatened in the Virgin Islands. And because of that, we actually have a long-term monitoring data set for this species. So they were counted from 1993 to 2019 in both territories. And that's important because roseate terns shift colony sites yearly, and their colonies are monotypic. And so it's important that counts are conducted in both territories simultaneously to make sure we're accounting for all of the birds in the region, because we don't really understand movement among these territories. And this count also involved extensive coverage of potential nesting islands in the Virgin Islands to locate all colonies. And so at the same time, we're looking at all of these islands and making sure we're not accounting for any kind of pop-up colonies of some of our other focal species. And so for all of the terns, these were conducted as peak period surveys between the last week of May and first week of June. The rationale for that time period is we're trying to count nests at a time of peak nesting, but before peak chick hatching, to reduce thermal stress to chicks. And so our counting process, we have to swim out to the islands. We cannot land a boat on them because of coral reefs. So we have to swim all our gear out to the islands, hike up into these colonies. And when possible, we have 2 observers count because of the cryptic nature of a lot of these nests. And then we average totals between them. And so here's a kind of somewhat comprehensive look of our study area. So these are a lot of the focal islands. You'll note that this area does not cover the entire Virgin Islands. So St. Croix, which is kind of down to the left part of the US Virgin Islands, only has nesting least terns, and those are managed by US Fish and Wildlife. So we did not include them in this study. And for the British Virgin Islands, we did not include the island of Anegada, which is kind of up to the top right, and that's because it's pretty difficult to access. But these are some of the primary nesting islands that we were focusing on for our contemporary counts. Just as kind of an oddity, or not an oddity, but an unfortunate incident. So between our 2016 and 2018 counts, Hurricanes Irma and Maria hit the Virgin Islands. So this was a catastrophic hurricane season for this region. You can see this is the island of Jost Van Dyke in July of 2017 and then September of 2017. So there were really major changes to the marine habitat and to the terrestrial habitat because of these hurricanes. And we anticipated we might see some effects on some of our focal seabird species, particularly the residents, which would have been in the region for the hurricane. And just really quickly for resident and migratory species, we really ended up only getting data for the US Virgin Islands. Mass boobies and red-footed boobies were extirpated from the BVI pre-2000. We don't have a good date for that. And brown pelican and brown booby counts were not able to be conducted in the British Virgin Islands in the winter of the 2016 to 2018. And that's really unfortunate because anecdotal evidence suggests both species are in heavy decline, but we don't have the data to back that up. Similarly, royal terns were extirpated from the BVI sometime in the 90s, and sandwich terns only nest in Anegada, where we did not survey. So for the British Virgin Islands, we're only presenting results from roseate terns. So this isn't the most dynamic way to look at count data, but again, I wanted to kind of avoid the impression that this is representative of sort of a quantitative trend. So this is just qualitative data. And in the top, we have data compiled from 2000 and 2009. So these do not represent, again, counts from those years, but just the sort of expert opinion of seabird population sizes around that time period. And we can contrast those to counts on the bottom. So we also have some counts from 2013 that were conducted by USVI, Division of Fish and Wildlife. And what we can really focus on is that we've had some major declines for our resident species. So brown pelicans have gone from an estimated, oops, typo there, 300 or 350 individuals or breeding pairs, sorry, to about 135 as of 2018. Mass boobies have gone from around 45 to 105 individuals to 17 as of 2018. And in 2019, I counted the summer count and only saw one chick. We are not currently aware if the species continues to be present in the Virgin Islands as of 2021. Red-footed boobies, there were about 100 to 200 as of the early 2000s. Those were extirpated from the territory sometime in the early 2000s and are no longer found in either the US or British Virgin Islands. And brown boobies have gone from about 500 to 1,000 breeding pairs to around 160 as of 2018. Promisingly, though, we didn't see any major effects from the 2017 hurricane. So population counts before and after the hurricane were pretty comparable. So it suggests that at least in the immediate year following the hurricane, we didn't have a large population loss or drop off with nesting rather. And looking at our migratory species, again, this is for the US Virgin Islands only. We don't see a major magnitude of difference, and that's partly because these prior counts were so ephemeral. So royal terns were estimated from 150 to 780 individuals, and sandwich terns from anywhere from 200 to 1,300 individuals. So there's a really broad range of counts here. Currently, we're at about 118 for royal tern and 340 for sandwich tern. So there appears to be a declining trend, but maybe not a drastic one. Again, we did not really see an effect of the hurricane on these migratory species. Looking quickly at roseate terns. So as I mentioned, we believe that the Virgin Islands population or Virgin Islands roseate terns constitute one population, but we don't have a good understanding of movement between these two territories. And so I've chosen to break them out into two separate groups here to better show sort of changes in territory use over time. So we calculated lambda, and a lambda of 1 indicates population is stable. Here for both territories, we have a lambda under 1, and in addition, clearly the R squared line is showing a decline in population abundance for both territories. Decline is much more drastic in the British Virgin Islands, and kind of the understanding in these areas where in times of low population abundance in the British Virgin Islands, it was thought that maybe all the terns were in the US Virgin Islands. And so here we're clearly showing that this is not in fact the case, in that whether or not these are exchanging individuals annually, we're seeing clear declines for both of these areas. So overall, we observed declining trends for all the species observed, and it appears to be more drastic for some than others. We do believe that these trends are reflective of greater seabird trends in the Virgin Islands. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence out of this region that we're seeing mass declines in laughing gulls, bridal terns, and sooty terns, but we just don't have data from that region, and that's really unfortunate. So when data is not published, it's not used, and anecdotal evidence is not often put into the record, but really strong evidence for declines. However, we didn't see an effect or an immediate effect of the 2017 hurricanes, and that was some pretty great news because that was really devastating for the region. There's so many potential potential causes of declines, and they probably vary by species given the different life histories of the species I'm discussing here. So nest predation by invasive species like brown rats appears to really hit the terns. We see a ton of marine habitat degradation in this area. Climate change is a huge issue. So this region has experienced a degree Celsius increase in temperature since 1970s. So that's clearly having an effect on the marine fauna. And overfishing is a big issue. In the British Virgin Islands, we also see a lack of protection for seabird nesting islands. This is, as I said, an area of really high tourism, and there's high disturbance on some of these islands. So in this photo, I'm standing on Green Key, which was historically a very important breeding island for roseate terns, and I'm looking at Sandy Spit, which used to host breeding sandwich terns. These areas are now incredibly popular with tourists, and so seabirds are no longer nesting on these islands, almost certainly because of that high traffic. And in other regions, we see seabirds are kind of used as indicators of marine habitat quality. And if you know, we can kind of link seabirds to the marine habitat in this region, I would say that they may really be functioning as kind of a canary in the coal mine, highlighting that there are some ecosystem-wide issues. Quickly, we have a ton of recommendations for this area. Clearly, we have a need for rigorous and standardized seabird surveys to better quantify seabird population trends. I think prey availability and chick provisioning and condition are real research gaps that might help fill in some of the blanks of why we're seeing these declines. And also the effect of sea surface temperature increases on baitfish prey base. We just don't have any data from this area on baitfish abundances. And I would also make a plug that nest survival and productivity should really be investigated. We don't have really any data on adult survivorship, juvenile survivorship, or nest survivorship for most of these species, but nest survival is kind of the easiest place to start. So this is a really collaborative project, and I have a ton of people and a ton of funding sources to thank, and I really want to thank the Waterbird Society for hosting this talk today.
Thank you, Paige. Great presentation. We are a bit over time, so the other panel has already started.
Uh-oh.
So if other people want to go there, they can. If anyone wants to stay and ask questions of Paige, you can as well. So
thank you all so much.
I do want to plug in to attend the business meeting, the committee fair, and the award ceremony this afternoon. So everyone, please join at that time.
And be sure to bid in the silent auction.
Yes.
It benefits students and non-North American scientists to attend our meeting next year.
All right. I think Dave wrote something, but I don't know if it's a question.
More of a comment.
Yeah, more of a comment.
It's very true. It's easy to get, I think, a little myopic in assessments of these sort of types of data when you're working in a region with data deficiencies. But of course, data is an issue everywhere. Everyone has funding issues. Everyone has issues with data collection.
Oh, Kate has her hand up. So go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, Paige, I was thinking about your data deficiency stuff, just wondering if there's been any talk about using local ecological knowledge in a systematic way in a future study.
I think that's a great idea, and there hasn't really been a lot of talk of it. So I think, you know, Birds Caribbean, like Jen was saying, has kind of been so great at getting citizen science and local knowledge and sort of incorporated to these bird monitoring platforms. And that seems to be less utilized in the Virgin Islands, and it might just be the nature of the islands, but there's a lot less offshore activity around these areas except for fisher people. There's no birding on these islands, and people aren't really allowed, so we can't really incorporate citizen science into collecting these data. So local knowledge has been great for kind of establishing where to look for birds, and also, as I said, so much local evidence from fisher folk of these population declines, but not really a push to make a systematic approach to sort of using that in the future.
All right. No more questions, anyone? Doesn't seem like it.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all for attending. And if you want to go over to the next session already in progress, go ahead.
It was a great
Thanks to all the
session. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks to all the presenters as well. You guys did a great job, and I enjoyed listening to all your talks.